Theodore was laughing loudly when Delilah shouted, "You'll never be anything more than a miserable janitor." Samuel, the kind man who tended the gardens, trembled, but didn't lower his gaze. What he said next made Theodore's laughter freeze on his face forever. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Whitmore mansion as Theodore pushed through the heavy oak doors, his expensive leather shoes echoing in what should have been a welcoming silence. Instead, harsh voices pierced the air like broken glass, shattering the peace he had imagined during his 3-day business trip to Chicago. His briefcase dropped to the floor with a dull thud as he followed the sounds toward the kitchen, his heart beginning to race with an unexplained dread that seemed to seep from the very walls around him. What he witnessed in the doorway froze every muscle in his body and sent ice water rushing through his veins. Delilah Morrison, the woman he had trusted with his family's care for over 2 years, stood towering over Samuel Rodriguez, the gentle man who tended their gardens and fixed broken things with calloused but caring hands. Her face was twisted with a cruelty Theodore had never seen before. Her finger pointed like a weapon at Samuel's chest while Uncle George cowered in the corner, his 78-year-old frame shaking like a leaf in a storm. "You pathetic excuse for a man." Delilah's voice cut through the air sharp enough to draw blood, her words dripping with venom that seemed to poison the very atmosphere around them. "You think you can waltz around this house like you own something, like you matter to anyone here?" Samuel's weathered hands trembled as he clutched a broken picture frame, his kind brown eyes filled with a pain so deep it made Theodore's chest ache. But there was something else there too, a quiet dignity that refused to be crushed despite the verbal assault raining down on him like hail. The scene before Theodore felt surreal, like stepping into a nightmare where everything familiar had been twisted into something dark and threatening. This was his sanctuary, the place where his beloved wife Margaret had once filled every room with laughter and warmth, where his elderly relatives should have been living out their golden years in comfort and safety. Instead, he was witnessing something that made his successful business empire feel meaningless. Watching a woman he had paid handsomely to provide care, systematically destroying the spirit of a man whose only crime seemed to be existing in her presence. Uncle George's terrified whimper cut through Theodore's shock like a knife through silk, and suddenly the reality of what he was seeing crashed over him with the force of a tidal wave. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern, a system of abuse that had been happening right under his nose while he buried himself in boardrooms and profit margins, too consumed with building his fortune to notice that his family was being terrorized in their own home. Theodore's mind raced backward through fragments of memories that suddenly took on sinister new meanings, puzzle pieces that had been scattered and ignored now forming a horrifying picture of systematic cruelty and manipulation. The way Uncle George had started flinching whenever footsteps approached, the nervous tremor in Aunt Eleanor's voice during their brief phone conversations, the way Samuel always seemed to hurry through his tasks whenever Delilah appeared. Signs he had dismissed as natural aging or workplace hierarchy now blazed in his consciousness like warning fires he had been too blind to see. Delilah Morrison had arrived at the Whitmore estate 2 years ago, with impeccable references and a warm smile that had fooled everyone, including Theodore's sharp business instincts that had made him millions in real estate development. She was a woman in her mid-40s with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, and eyes that could shift from grandmother warm to Arctic cold in the span of a heartbeat. Her credentials were spotless, her demeanor professional, and her ability to manage the household seemed like a blessing sent from heaven during Theodore's darkest period of grief following Margaret's unexpected passing. The irony wasn't lost on him now as he stood frozen in that doorway, remembering how grateful he had felt when Delilah took charge of everything: the meals, the cleaning, the care of his elderly relatives who had moved in after Margaret's departure, when their own health began failing. She had seemed like the answer to prayers he didn't even know he was praying, allowing him to throw himself completely into his work, without worrying about the day-to-day management of a household that felt too empty and too full of painful memories at the same time. Samuel Rodriguez was everything Delilah pretended to be: genuinely kind, selflessly devoted to others, and possessed of a quiet strength that seemed to flow from some deep well of compassion that had never run dry, despite whatever hardships life had thrown his way. He was a man in his 50s who spoke with a gentle accent that hinted at roots in Mexico, whose hands could coax life from dying plants, and who always had a soft word for Uncle George when the old man became confused about where he was or what year it was happening around him. The contrast between them was stark and damning. Delilah with her false sweetness that turned to poison the moment she thought no one was watching, and Samuel with his authentic kindness that remained constant whether he thought anyone noticed or not. Theodore realized with growing horror that he had been paying the wrong person to care for his family, trusting the wolf, while the shepherd worked for minimum wage. The revelation of Delilah's true nature unfolded before Theodore like a toxic flower, blooming in fast motion, each petal revealing another layer of calculated manipulation that made his stomach churn with disgust and self-recrimination. She had constructed an elaborate facade of competence and caring that had fooled him completely, presenting herself as the perfect household manager while systematically establishing herself as the undisputed ruler of a domain where cruelty masqueraded as efficiency and fear passed for respect. Her methods were sophisticated and deliberately designed to remain invisible to outside observers, particularly Theodore himself, who she had quickly identified as someone whose grief and guilt made him desperate to delegate responsibility rather than confront the painful reality of life without Margaret. Delilah had studied his patterns with the precision of a predator, learning exactly when he would be traveling, how long his business trips typically lasted, and most importantly, how little attention he paid to the daily operations of his own home when he was consumed with closing deals and expanding his empire. The psychological warfare she waged against Uncle George, Aunt Eleanor, and Samuel was carefully calibrated to break their spirits, without leaving physical evidence that might raise questions or suspicions. She would wait until Theodore's car disappeared down the long driveway before transforming from the helpful housekeeper into a tyrant who ruled through intimidation, verbal abuse, and the constant threat that any complaints would result in the elderly relatives being sent to nursing homes and Samuel being fired without references. Her control extended far beyond mere housekeeping duties, reaching into every aspect of life within the mansion's walls like poisonous vines that strangled everything they touched. She monitored phone calls, intercepted mail, and gradually isolated Theodore's relatives from their few remaining friends by claiming they were too tired for visitors or too unwell for social activities. Samuel became her favorite target because his natural protectiveness toward the elderly made him a threat to her absolute authority, and his undocumented status made him vulnerable to her threats about reporting him to immigration authorities. The financial manipulation was perhaps the most insidious aspect of her reign of terror, as she had gradually gained access to household accounts under the guise of managing expenses more efficiently. Small amounts disappeared regularly, explained away as necessary purchases for the house or medical expenses for the elderly residents, while larger sums were diverted through a complex web of false invoices and inflated service charges that would have impressed even Theodore's business competitors with their creativity and boldness. Theodore realized that Delilah had turned his own home into a prison, where the guards had convinced the warden that everything was running smoothly, while the inmates suffered in silence. Standing in that doorway, Theodore felt the weight of every ignored phone call, every shortened conversation, and every excuse he had accepted without question, crashing down on him like an avalanche of guilt and regret that threatened to bury him alive. The signs had been there all along, written in Uncle George's increasingly withdrawn behavior, in Aunt Eleanor's nervous laughter that never quite reached her eyes, and in Samuel's way of glancing over his shoulder whenever he worked in the garden as if expecting an attack from behind at any moment. Uncle George had tried to tell him during their last conversation, his voice shaking with something Theodore had dismissed as natural aging, but now recognized as terror that had been building for months. The old man had started to say something about feeling uncomfortable in his own room, about strange noises at night and doors that he was sure he had left open being found locked in the morning. But Theodore had been rushing to catch a flight to Seattle and had cut the conversation short with promises to talk more when he returned home. Aunt Eleanor's sudden reluctance to answer the phone when he called had seemed like nothing more than the typical confusion that came with her advancing dementia. But now Theodore remembered the way her voice would drop to a whisper whenever she mentioned Delilah's name, and how she would quickly change the subject if he asked about her daily routine, or whether she was happy with the care she was receiving in his absence. The financial red flags that his business-trained mind should have caught were glaringly obvious in retrospect. Medical bills for treatments that seemed excessive for routine care, household expenses that had tripled without explanation, and mysterious charges for services that Uncle George swore he had never requested or received. Delilah had always had reasonable explanations, delivered with the kind of professional confidence that made questioning her seem petty and ungrateful, especially when Theodore was so desperate to believe that everything at home was being handled competently while he focused on his work. Samuel's attempts to communicate concerns had been the most heartbreaking missed opportunity of all, as the gentleman had tried multiple times to approach Theodore about strange incidents and troubling changes in the household atmosphere. His limited English and natural shyness had made it easy for Theodore to misunderstand his carefully worded warnings as simple workplace complaints, and Delilah's presence during most of these conversations had created an atmosphere where Samuel's true concerns could never be fully expressed or properly understood. The realization that he had failed everyone who depended on him hit Theodore like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his knees threaten to buckle under the enormous weight of responsibility and regret. The discovery of Margaret's hidden letter came 3 days after the kitchen confrontation, tucked away in a jewelry box that Theodore had avoided opening since her passing, because the sight of her wedding ring still had the power to bring him to his knees with grief that felt as fresh and raw as if she had left him yesterday instead of 3 years ago. His hands shook as he unfolded the cream-colored paper that bore her elegant handwriting, and the words he read there hit him with the force of a revelation that changed everything he thought he knew about the last months of her life. My beloved Theodore. The letter began in Margaret's familiar script that always looked like poetry even when she was writing grocery lists. If you are reading this, then something has happened to me, and you have finally opened this box that I pray you will never need to find. I am writing this because I am deeply concerned about Delilah Morrison, and I fear that my suspicions about her true nature may put our family in danger if I am no longer here to protect them from what I believe she is capable of doing. The words that followed painted a picture of a woman who had been far more observant than Theodore had ever realized, documenting incidents and behaviors that revealed Margaret's growing awareness of Delilah's manipulative nature and hidden cruelty. She had noticed the way Delilah's demeanor changed when she thought no one was watching, the subtle ways she undermined authority and created dependencies that served her own interests rather than the family's welfare, and most disturbingly, the careful way she seemed to be positioning herself to become indispensable while making everyone else feel replaceable and vulnerable. Margaret had been particularly concerned about what would happen to Uncle George and Aunt Eleanor if she were no longer there to provide a buffer between them and Delilah's increasingly controlling behavior, and she had documented specific incidents where she had witnessed verbal abuse that stopped abruptly whenever Theodore or other family members appeared. Her growing illness had made her feel powerless to confront the situation directly, but she had been planning to have a serious conversation with Theodore about finding alternative arrangements for household management. The most chilling part of the letter was Margaret's description of finding Uncle George crying in his room after what appeared to be a verbal assault from Delilah, and her realization that the woman had been systematically breaking down the confidence and dignity of the elderly relatives while presenting herself as their devoted caregiver to the outside world. Margaret had begun keeping a detailed record of incidents, but her declining health had prevented her from completing the investigation she had started. Theodore clutched the letter to his chest as tears streamed down his face, grieving not only for his wife's loss but for the validation that her final worries had been prophetic warnings he had been too overwhelmed to receive. Armed with Margaret's letter as both guidance and motivation, Theodore began his investigation with the methodical precision that had made him successful in business. But this time, the stakes were infinitely more personal, and the enemy was already inside his walls, poisoning the very air his family breathed. He installed hidden cameras throughout the house under the pretense of upgrading the security system, positioning them to capture the common areas where most of the household interactions took place, while being careful to respect the privacy of bedrooms and bathrooms where his elderly relatives deserved to feel safe from surveillance. The footage he collected over the following weeks was more disturbing than anything his imagination had prepared him for, revealing a pattern of psychological torture that was both systematic and sadistic in its deliberate cruelty. Delilah transformed into a completely different person the moment Theodore's car disappeared from view, her mask of professional competence sliding away to reveal a woman who seemed to derive genuine pleasure from making others feel small, worthless, and afraid of her unpredictable moods and arbitrary rules. Samuel bore the brunt of her cruelest attacks, enduring verbal assaults that were designed to strip away his dignity and sense of self-worth, while she berated him for imaginary failures and threatened to have him deported if he dared to complain about his treatment. The gentleman would stand silently during these tirades, his shoulders hunched with the weight of humiliation. But Theodore noticed that Samuel's eyes never lost their essential kindness, even when they filled with tears that he was forbidden to shed in Delilah's presence. Uncle George and Aunt Eleanor were subjected to a different but equally devastating form of abuse, as Delilah used their age and vulnerability against them with calculated precision that would have been impressive if it weren't so utterly heartless. She would move their personal belongings without explanation, hide their medications until they became panicked and disoriented, and then present herself as their savior when she found the missing items in places where she had obviously hidden them herself. The financial records Theodore examined revealed a web of theft and fraud that was staggering in its scope and audacity, with Delilah having systematically skimmed money from household accounts while creating fake expenses and forged receipts that documented services and supplies that had never been provided. She had even gone so far as to establish relationships with corrupt medical providers who would bill for unnecessary treatments and procedures, splitting the insurance payments while subjecting the elderly relatives to invasive examinations and medications they didn't actually need. Theodore's anger grew with each piece of evidence he uncovered, but he forced himself to remain calm and methodical, knowing that his family's safety depended on his ability to build an airtight case before confronting the woman who had turned their home into her personal kingdom of cruelty. The formation of an unlikely alliance began when Theodore approached Samuel during one of the man's early morning garden sessions, finding him tending to Margaret's rose bushes with the same gentle care he had always shown, but with shoulders that now carried the visible weight of months of abuse and humiliation. The conversation that followed was halting and difficult, as Samuel's limited English and natural fear of authority figures made him reluctant to speak openly about what he had endured. But Theodore's genuine concern and obvious anger at what had been happening gradually broke through the barriers that Delilah had so carefully constructed around her victims. Samuel's revelation about the lengths he had gone to protect Uncle George and Aunt Eleanor painted a picture of quiet heroism that humbled Theodore and filled him with a respect for this man that went far beyond employee and employer dynamics. Samuel had been absorbing the worst of Delilah's abuse deliberately, positioning himself as her primary target in order to shield the elderly relatives from treatment that could have broken their already fragile spirits completely, and he had been documenting incidents in a small notebook written in Spanish that he kept hidden in the tool shed behind the house. Uncle George's transformation when he realized that Theodore finally knew the truth was both heartbreaking and inspiring, as the old man's relief at being believed and protected unlocked a flood of details about the psychological warfare that had been waged against him for months. His memory, which seemed foggy and uncertain when he was frightened, became remarkably sharp when he felt safe enough to speak freely about the incidents that had terrorized him in his own home, and his accounts corroborated everything that Theodore had observed through the hidden cameras and financial records. Aunt Eleanor's contribution to their growing body of evidence came in the form of a detailed diary she had been keeping in her bedroom, writing in careful script about each day's events as a way to maintain her sanity and sense of reality when Delilah's gaslighting techniques made her question her own perceptions and memories. Her entries revealed the sophisticated psychological manipulation tactics that Delilah employed, including moving objects and then denying they had ever been in different locations, changing radio stations and television channels, and claiming that the elderly woman was becoming confused and forgetful. The three men spent long hours planning their confrontation with Delilah, with Theodore insisting that they needed to be absolutely certain of their facts and evidence before taking any action that might give her an opportunity to escape justice or retaliate against her victims. Samuel's knowledge of Delilah's daily routines and Uncle George's understanding of her psychological patterns proved invaluable in developing a strategy that would expose her crimes while protecting the people she had victimized for so long. The confrontation unfolded on a gray Thursday morning when Delilah arrived for what she believed would be another ordinary day of ruling her domain, with an iron fist disguised as a helpful hand. But Theodore was waiting for her in the main living room with Uncle George, Aunt Eleanor, and Samuel standing behind him like an army of truth that could no longer be silenced or intimidated. The look of shock that crossed her face when she realized that her carefully constructed kingdom of lies was crumbling around her was quickly replaced by the calculating expression of someone who had talked her way out of difficult situations before and believed she could do so again. Theodore's voice was steady and cold as he laid out the evidence he had gathered, producing the hidden camera footage, the financial records, Margaret's letter, and the detailed accounts from her victims that painted an undeniable picture of systematic abuse and theft that had been perpetrated under the guise of care and assistance. Delilah's initial strategy was to deny everything with the kind of indignant outrage that had served her well in the past, claiming that she was being unfairly accused by people whose mental faculties were compromised by age and whose gratitude for her devoted service had somehow been twisted into resentment. As Theodore continued presenting evidence that demolished each of her denials, Delilah's mask began to slip more dramatically, revealing flashes of the vicious cruelty that had been her true nature all along, hidden beneath layers of false sweetness and professional competence that had fooled him for far too long. Her voice rose to a near shriek as she realized that her web of lies and manipulation was being systematically destroyed, and she began lashing out at everyone in the room with the kind of verbal violence that had been her weapon of choice against people she had considered too weak to fight back. The moment that broke her completely came when Samuel stepped forward and quietly but firmly described the specific incidents of abuse he had endured and witnessed, his halting English somehow making his testimony even more powerful as he struggled to find words for cruelties that should never have existed in any language. Delilah's response was a torrent of racist invective and classist hatred that revealed the depths of her prejudice and contempt for anyone she considered beneath her station, finally showing Theodore and his family the true face of evil that had been living among them. Uncle George's whispered statement that he was no longer afraid of her seemed to deflate whatever fight remained in Delilah, as she realized that her power had been built entirely on fear and secrecy, both of which had been destroyed by the simple act of bringing her crimes into the light where they could no longer hide. Justice came swiftly once the truth was revealed, though not through the dramatic courtroom scenes that might have satisfied Theodore's desire for public vindication, but rather through the quiet effectiveness of consequences that fit the crimes and ensured that Delilah could never again use her position of trust to hurt vulnerable people who depended on others for their daily care and dignity. The evidence Theodore had gathered was more than sufficient to support criminal charges for theft, fraud, and elder abuse, but the family chose a path that focused on restitution and prevention rather than revenge, understanding that their primary goal was healing rather than punishment. Delilah's immediate termination was accompanied by the recovery of stolen funds through civil proceedings that revealed the full extent of her financial crimes, with assets being seized and liquidated to repay every penny she had stolen from the household accounts over the course of her employment. The corrupt medical providers who had collaborated with her fraudulent billing schemes faced their own investigations and sanctions, creating a ripple effect that would protect other vulnerable patients from similar exploitation in the future. More importantly for the family's peace of mind, Delilah's record of abuse was thoroughly documented and reported to licensing agencies and background check services, ensuring that she would never again be able to obtain employment in any position that gave her access to elderly or vulnerable individuals who might become targets for her particular brand of psychological terrorism and financial manipulation. The network of references she had used to secure her position at the Whitmore estate was investigated and exposed as fraudulent, revealing that she had been operating her scheme for years across multiple households. Samuel's immigration status was resolved through Theodore's connections and resources, providing him with the legal documentation and security that removed Delilah's most powerful weapon against him, while recognizing his contributions to the family's welfare and his courage in standing up to abuse despite the personal risks involved. His official employment as the estate's groundskeeper and maintenance supervisor came with a substantial salary increase and benefits package that reflected his true value to the household, rather than treating him as expendable labor. The transformation in Uncle George and Aunt Eleanor was remarkable to witness, as the removal of constant fear and intimidation allowed their natural personalities to resurface like flowers blooming after a long winter of darkness and cold. Their confidence returned gradually but steadily, along with their appetite for life and their ability to enjoy simple pleasures that had been stolen from them by months of psychological warfare designed to make them feel worthless and unwanted in their own home. Theodore's realization that justice sometimes requires patience and wisdom rather than immediate satisfaction gave him a sense of closure that felt more meaningful than any courtroom victory could have provided. 2 years later, the Whitmore mansion had been transformed from a house of fear into a home filled with the kind of warmth and laughter that Margaret would have recognized and celebrated, proving that healing was not only possible, but inevitable when love was allowed to flourish without the poison of cruelty and manipulation, contaminating every interaction. The morning sunlight streamed through windows that no longer seemed to hold shadows, illuminating scenes of domestic happiness that had once seemed impossible during the darkest days of Delilah's reign of terror. Uncle George could be found most mornings in the garden working alongside Samuel, their friendship having blossomed into something that transcended the artificial barriers of age and background, as they shared stories and wisdom while tending to plants that seemed to mirror their own journey from near destruction to vibrant renewal. The old man's hands had regained their steadiness as his confidence returned, and his laughter rang out across the grounds with a joy that had been missing for too long during those months of fear and uncertainty. Aunt Eleanor had become the unofficial historian of their household, documenting the daily happenings and celebrations in a new diary that focused on gratitude and hope rather than fear and confusion. Her entries now filled with descriptions of family dinners, holiday preparations, and the small kindnesses that made each day feel like a gift rather than an ordeal to be endured. Her room, once a place of hiding and trembling, had become a sanctuary decorated with photographs and mementos that celebrated life, rather than merely surviving it. Samuel's position in the family had evolved far beyond that of an employee, as he became the brother and son that genetics had never provided, his gentle presence serving as a constant reminder that goodness exists in the world, and that protecting others is one of humanity's highest callings. His own family, brought north from Mexico through Theodore's sponsorship, added new dimensions of joy and culture to the household, with children's laughter echoing through rooms that had once known only whispered fears and stifled tears. Theodore himself had discovered that true wealth couldn't be measured in bank accounts or business acquisitions, but rather in the peace that comes from knowing that the people you love are safe, valued, and free to be themselves, without fear of retribution or abuse from those who mistake authority for license to harm others. The success he had achieved in the business world paled in comparison to the satisfaction of creating a home where dignity was protected and kindness was the governing principle that guided every decision and interaction. As he watched his reconstructed family sharing dinner around the table where Delilah had once held court through intimidation, Theodore understood that sometimes the greatest victories are measured not in what we build, but in what we refuse to let be destroyed.